My name is Elisa Robles, and I'm 29 years old. 3 days ago, I learned something about the man I thought I was building a life with, something so small on the surface, so easy to dismiss as just a joke, that it took being left alone at a gas station 50 miles from home for it to finally make sense. I'd been living in my apartment for 4 years by then. My name was the only one on the lease, always had been. When Stanley Wright, my boyfriend of 18 months, moved in after his lease ended, it felt natural at the time. He contributed $400 a month, which didn't even cover half the utilities, but I didn't mind. I made decent money, and I loved him. I told myself that partnerships weren't about keeping score, that this was what building something together looked like. Stanley's younger sister, Lena Wright, was 25 and lived across town. They were close in a way that sometimes made me feel like I was stepping into a conversation already halfway finished. Inside jokes, shared looks, sentences, they seemed to finish for each other without even trying. I used to laugh it off, telling myself that strong sibling bonds were a good thing, that it was immature to feel like a third wheel. Looking back, I realize how often I ignored that quiet, uncomfortable feeling in my chest because I didn't want to seem difficult. The trip to the outlet mall was Stanley's idea. A casual Saturday, nothing special. Lena came along because, according to them, it was supposed to be a fun day, and I was included because I was apparently so fun to shop with. Stanley drove my car, he didn't have one, and we joked, we talked, everything felt normal. Too normal, maybe. I didn't notice the way they kept glancing at each other, or how Lena smirked when I mentioned needing a bathroom break. We stopped at a gas station. I went inside to grab snacks and use the restroom. 5 minutes, maybe less. When I walked back outside, the parking spot where my car had been was empty. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake. I stood there scanning the lot, walking a slow circle, my brain lagging behind reality. Then my phone buzzed. "Gotcha. You should see your face, Ev. We're around the corner watching. This is hilarious." Another message followed almost immediately. "This is what you get for being boring. Lighten up." I laughed once out loud because it still didn't feel real. I texted back that it was funny that they could come back now. A minute passed, then 5, then 10. Each message that followed brushed aside my growing unease, reframing it as overreaction, as sensitivity, as me being the problem. Standing there alone, watching cars pull in and out while my phone filled with laughter at my expense, something in me shifted. Not anger, something colder, clearer. These were two grown adults who thought it was funny to leave me stranded and mock me for being upset about it. So I stopped asking them to come back. I opened a rideshare app, closed it, then called a taxi company instead. When the dispatcher told me it would cost $120 to get to the airport, I said yes without hesitation. As I waited, more messages came in, teasing, dismissive, confident. I'd still be there when they decided the joke was over. When the cab pulled up, I got in without responding. That was the moment I chose myself, even if I didn't fully understand it yet. The cab door shut with a dull, final thud. And as we pulled away from the gas station, I watched the fluorescent lights shrink in the rearview mirror. My phone buzzed again, in my lap screen lighting up with Stanley's name, then Lena's, then Stanley's again. I didn't look at the messages right away. I already knew what they would say. Variations of, "Where are you? This isn't funny anymore. You're being dramatic." Words designed to pull me back into the same dynamic where my discomfort was treated like a flaw. The driver asked if the airport was still the destination, glancing at me through the mirror. I said yes, and my voice didn't shake. That surprised me. Inside, my thoughts were lining up neatly, one after another, like pieces clicking into place. I wasn't running away. I was creating distance. Physical distance. First emotional distance soon after. As we drove, I finally glanced at my phone. The messages had shifted from smug to confused, then slowly to uneasy. Stanley wanted to know where I'd gone. Lena said I was taking things too far. I typed one reply, then deleted it. Explanations had never helped before. They only invited debate. At the airport, I paid the driver, thanked him, and walked inside with nothing but my purse and the clothes I was wearing. The next flight leaving was to Las Vegas. I didn't care about the destination. I cared about the direction away. I booked the ticket without overthinking it, the way you do when you already know a decision is right. While I waited at the gate, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my landlord. I explained briefly and professionally that I needed to add temporary security measures to my apartment. He didn't ask for details. He just said he'd send someone over within the hour. The second call was to a security company. I told them I needed overnight coverage and gave them photos of Stanley and Lena. When they quoted the price $200, I agreed immediately. It wasn't revenge, it was insurance. The third call was to my best friend Marcus. I told him what happened, every detail, my voice steady, even as the reality of it settled in. They left you 50 miles from home, he said, incredulous. As a prank, I replied, and they kept laughing. There was a pause, then quietly, yeah, I'll be there. Tell me what you need. By the time I boarded the plane, my phone was lighting up nonstop. I turned it off as the engines roared to life, the hum vibrating through my bones. For the first time that day, I let myself breathe. I landed in Vegas late that night, checked into a hotel, turned my phone back on. 152 messages, 34 missed calls. I didn't read them all. I didn't need to. The pattern was obvious. Confusion, panic, anger, desperation. Somewhere in there, they'd gone back to my apartment and discovered they couldn't get inside. Somewhere in there, the jokes stopped being funny. I sent one message to the group chat short, factual, final. You left me stranded as a prank. I found my own way. The apartment is mine. The lease is in my name. You do not live there legally. We're done. You can collect your belongings next week with notice. Then I blocked them both. I ordered room service, turned on a random movie, and sat there in a quiet hotel room that felt strangely peaceful. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel guilty. I felt light, like I'd finally set down something heavy I didn't realize I'd been carrying. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back to being the punchline. I didn't hear the knock on my apartment door that night. I didn't hear the raised voices in the hallway, the sharp edge creeping into Lena's tone, or Stanley insisting over and over that this was his home too. I was already thousands of miles away, sitting in a darkened theater watching acrobats twist through the air, my phone face down in my purse. At some point during the show, it vibrated hard enough to rattle against the seat, but I didn't reach for it. I already knew what was happening back home. I could picture it with uncomfortable clarity. The next morning, sunlight spilling through the hotel curtains, I finally checked my voicemail. There it was. Calm, official, carefully neutral. An officer informing me there had been a dispute at my residence involving a man claiming he'd been locked out. They wanted me to call back when I had a moment. I didn't rush. I made coffee, stood by the window, watched the city wake up below me. Only then did I return the call. The conversation was brief, polite, almost anticlimactic. I explained that Stanley was my ex-boyfriend, that he had been a guest in my apartment, that his name was not on the lease and never had been. Yes, he had belongings there. Yes, I was willing to arrange a time for him to retrieve them with notice and a witness present. No, he did not have permission to enter the property otherwise. The officer listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and then thanked me for my cooperation. The law, it turned out, was very clear on this matter. When I flew home later that afternoon, the security guard Dave, according to the badge pinned to his uniform, was finishing his shift. He looked almost disappointed to see me like a movie ending before the best part. He told me they'd shown up late the night before, furious and confused, convinced that if they just argued long enough, reality would bend to their version of events. He told me Lena had threatened lawsuits and Stanley had insisted he paid rent, as if saying it enough times would make it true. I tipped Dave generously and thanked him. He said it was the most entertaining shift he'd had in months. Upstairs, the apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Stanley's clothes still hung in the closet, his toiletries lined up neatly beside mine in the bathroom, his books scattered across shelves I'd bought years before I met him. I stood there for a long moment, absorbing the silence. This space had felt crowded for a long time, and I hadn't even realized it. That night, Marcus forwarded me the messages Stanley had been sending him. Accusations. Pleas. Wild swings between rage and self-pity. He claimed I was abusive, that I'd humiliated him in front of the police, that I was holding his life hostage. Lena's messages were worse, long spiraling rants, painting me as a controlling psychopath, twisting the story until the prank disappeared, entirely replaced by a narrative where they were the victims of my cruelty. I didn't respond. I boxed Stanley's things instead. Slowly, methodically. Not out of spite, but because I wanted this chapter contained, labeled, and ready to be closed. Each box felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence I'd been trying to finish for months. By the time I went to bed, I knew this wasn't over. People who refuse to see themselves clearly rarely stop when the truth confronts them. They escalate, they rewrite, they grasp for leverage. And sure enough, the next message came not as an apology, but as a demand. By Saturday morning, everything was ready. 12 boxes lined the wall of my living room, each one sealed, labeled and itemized down to the smallest detail. Clothes sorted by season, books stacked and wrapped, electronics listed with serial numbers. I wasn't taking chances, not with accusations already flying, not with emotions this raw. Marcus arrived at 9:30, coffee in hand, phone, fully charged, ready to be a witness. We didn't talk much while we waited. There wasn't much left to say. At 10:15, the elevator doors opened, and Stanley stepped out first, followed by Lena and their father, Richard Wright. Richard looked tired, like a man who already knew this was going to be unpleasant, and had shown up anyway because it was his responsibility. Stanley avoided my eyes. Lena didn't. She stared at me like I'd committed some unforgivable crime by refusing to play along. I kept my voice level, professional. Everything's ready. I'll help you carry it down. Lena scoffed immediately, launching into how insane this all was, how I was really doing this over a joke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply corrected her. I reminded her that being abandoned 50 miles from home and mocked for over an hour wasn't a joke to me. It was a choice they made again and again, even after they knew I was upset. Inside the apartment, I stayed near the doorway while they checked the boxes. Marcus filmed everything quietly from the corner. For a few minutes, it went smoothly. Then Stanley froze, hands hovering over an open box. "Where's my laptop?" he asked. I told him which box contained it. He opened it, stared, then shook his head. "This wasn't the one he meant," he said. "The good one was missing. The expensive one." Lena jumped in immediately, accusing me of stealing it, her voice rising with every sentence. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and absurd all at once. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself beyond stating the facts. I had inventoried everything in the apartment. I had documented every item. If the laptop wasn't there, it wasn't there. Richard stepped in, then his tone firm but calm, asking Stanley if he might have left it somewhere else. Stanley insisted he hadn't, that I was lying, that I was punishing him. For 20 minutes, the same conversation looped in circles. Finally, Richard ended it. He told them to take what was there and deal with anything else separately. Lena glared at me, like this wasn't over. Stanley looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. As they carried the last box out, Stanley stopped and turned back to me. "We were good together," he said quietly. "You really threw everything away over one mistake." I met his eyes then finally. "You didn't make a mistake," I said. "You made a choice. And that choice showed me exactly who you are." Lena scoffed again, muttering something about me being too sensitive. I told them the collection window was over and asked them to leave. Richard nodded at me on his way out, something like understanding in his expression. When the door closed behind them, Marcus let out a long breath. We ordered pizza. We sat on the floor, surrounded by empty space where someone else's life used to be, and for the first time since the gas station, I felt certain. This wasn't chaos. This was closure beginning to take shape. The silence after they left didn't last long. By Monday morning, my phone, through a number Marcus was forwarding messages to, started filling up again. Not from Stanley directly this time, but through other channels, other voices, each one carrying the same distorted version of events. According to them, I wasn't a woman who'd been humiliated and abandoned. I was controlling, vindictive, abusive. The story had shifted just enough to make them feel justified in their outrage. Marcus played me a voicemail Stanley had left him. It was rambling, unfocused, swinging wildly between anger and desperation. One minute he was threatening to sue me for locking him out, the next he was asking how I could do this to someone I claimed to love. Lena's messages were sharper, more aggressive, accusing me of emotional abuse, insisting I'd traumatized her brother by embarrassing him in front of the police. It was fascinating in a bleak sort of way how completely the gas station had vanished from their narrative. Then came the email. It was long, dramatic, and full of legal-sounding language that didn't quite land right. Stanley claimed I'd stolen his MacBook, that I owed him $2,000 for emotional distress, and that I'd illegally evicted him despite his tenant rights. He gave me a deadline to comply before legal action would be taken. I read it once slowly, then forwarded it to a lawyer friend without comment. He called me 10 minutes later, laughing so hard he had to pause to catch his breath. The letter, he explained, wasn't from a real law firm. The formatting was sloppy. The threats were empty. Stanley had no case. None. The advice was simple: save everything, respond professionally if I responded at all, and otherwise let it burn itself out. I took his advice. Later that day, Marcus sent me a screenshot from a mutual friend's Instagram. Lena had posted a story, black background, white text, heavy with implication. Something about people showing their true colors about her brother going through the worst breakup of his life because his ex turned out to be a controlling psycho who stole his property. The comments were a mix of sympathy and skepticism. Some people remembered the prank. Some weren't buying it. The post disappeared a few hours later. That evening, I received a message I didn't expect. It was from Richard. He apologized. Not vaguely, not defensively, but clearly. He told me he hadn't known the full story until after Saturday, that what they'd done to me was wrong and that he was sorry. He said I'd handled the situation with more restraint than most people would have. I thanked him. I meant it. It mattered hearing someone from that family acknowledge reality. The accusations kept coming for a while after that, but they lost their momentum. Without my engagement, without a reaction to feed on, they began to collapse under their own weight. Lies need friction to survive. Silence starves them. By the end of the week, the anger had dulled into something else, desperation maybe, or confusion. The realization that no amount of outrage was going to pull me back into a story I no longer belonged to. And just when I thought it was finally winding down, Stanley tried one last thing. An apology. Sort of. Stanley's email arrived late at night, long enough that I knew before opening it that it wasn't going to say what it should have. I read it anyway, sitting at my kitchen table, the apartment quiet around me, in a way that finally felt intentional instead of empty. He wrote about thinking about missing me, about how everything had spiraled out of control. He said the prank had gone too far, that he regretted how things ended, that maybe if we talked, we could fix what was broken. What he didn't say mattered more than everything he did. There was no apology for leaving me alone at a gas station, no acknowledgement of the laughter, the mocking messages, the hour I stood there feeling small and disposable. Just regret that things hadn't turned out the way he wanted. I didn't respond. 2 days later, another email. Shorter, sharper. He didn't understand how I could throw away everything we had over one joke. He accused me of being cruel, of punishing him instead of forgiving him. Still no accountability. Still, I was the villain in his story. I didn't respond to that either. A week after the pickup, the missing laptop mystery resolved itself. Lena texted Marcus to say she'd found it at her apartment where Stanley had apparently left it months earlier and forgotten about. The message ended with a half-hearted apology. Sorry for accusing you, as if false allegations were just another misunderstanding to brush past. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The truth had arrived on its own. Life settled into something quieter after that. I changed the locks again, swapped out the temporary keys for new ones, and deep cleaned the apartment until it smelled like lemon and fresh starts. I donated the chair Stanley had brought and sold the lamp. I rearranged the furniture, reclaiming corners of the space I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for far too long. I went on a few dates. Nothing serious, just coffee conversation reminders that being with someone shouldn't feel like walking on eggshells. Work picked up. I got a promotion I'd been quietly hoping for. Marcus joked that the whole mess had been some kind of twisted catalyst forcing me to choose myself in a way I'd been avoiding. He wasn't wrong. I ran into Richard once at a grocery store. He asked how I was doing. I told him the truth, that I was good. He said Stanley was staying with them temporarily, that this whole situation had been a wake-up call. He admitted quietly that they might have spoiled their children, that Lena had a habit of pushing things too far. I wished them well. I meant it in a distant, detached way. People kept asking if I regretted how I handled it, if I wished I'd been more forgiving. The honest answer was no. What Stanley and Lena did wasn't a harmless joke. It was a test of how much I'd tolerate how easily my feelings could be dismissed. And when they realized there were consequences, they tried to rewrite the story instead of facing it. When they left me at that gas station, I could have begged, argued, waited. Instead, I left. Quietly, cleanly. I let their actions speak for themselves. They wanted to teach me to lighten up to take a joke. Instead, I learned something far more important, that love doesn't humiliate, that respect doesn't laugh at your discomfort, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away without screaming. Life's good now. Better than good. I'm planning a real vacation this time, maybe thinking about getting a cat. I move through my days without bracing for the next joke at my expense, without shrinking myself to keep the peace. They thought leaving me behind would be funny. I just showed them what it actually feels like to be left. My name is Barbara Phillips, and I was 31 years old when when a conversation that barely lasted 4 minutes quietly ended a 3-year relationship I thought would define my future. It didn't start with screaming or accusations or anything dramatic enough to warn me it was coming. It started with a sentence spoken almost casually, like she was commenting on the weather. My boyfriend stood in our kitchen, one hand wrapped around his coffee mug eyes, not quite meeting mine, and said, "I can't let go of my ex. We have too much history." For a moment, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. 3 years together had trained me to expect different words: reassurance, clarification, maybe even guilt. Instead, what I heard was certainty, not confusion, not conflict, just a fact he'd apparently already accepted long before saying it out loud. I told him calmly, "Then don't." The relief on his face was immediate and unmistakable. His shoulders dropped. His lips curved into something dangerously close to a smile. "You understand," he asked, like he'd just passed some emotional test. That was when I finished the thought, "But let go of me instead." The silence that followed was sharp and absolute. He blinked once, then again, like his brain needed time to catch up. What he asked, his voice suddenly unsteady. "I'm going solo," I said. "You can go back to your history." He panicked instantly, words tumbling out too fast to mean anything. He hadn't meant it like that. He hadn't thought I'd take it that way. He just meant, but it was already too late. Because something inside me had finally clicked into place. We had been together for 3 years. We met at a friend's birthday party, bonded over terrible karaoke and wine that tasted like regret. We moved in together after 18 months into a decent 2-bedroom apartment, splitting rent bills, groceries, responsibilities, everything evenly. Like adults building something real. We weren't engaged, but the future was implied in the way we planned. Holidays. Talked about neighborhoods. Joked about kids' names without realizing how serious that was. At least that's what I thought. 9 months ago, his ex-girlfriend moved back into the city. 5 years of history before me. A new job. A condo downtown. Suddenly she was everywhere. Coffee meetups, long lunches, just catching up sessions that stretched into hours. At first, I told myself this was what secure relationships look like. Trust, maturity, confidence. I didn't want to be the insecure girlfriend policing friendships. But 2 meetups a week became 3. 3 became 4. He canceled our plans, movie nights, dinner reservations, even my best friend's wedding after party, because she needed to talk. When I finally brought it up 6 weeks ago, I did it carefully, calmly. I told him I wasn't trying to control him, just that I felt like I was being sidelined. He got defensive immediately. He told me I was insecure, that 5 years of history didn't disappear just because I existed, that he chose me, so why couldn't I trust him? I tried to explain that choosing someone once didn't excuse choosing someone else over them repeatedly, but every conversation ended the same way, with me apologizing for having boundaries and him feeling justified for crossing them. Last week was the breaking point. We had planned a weekend trip for our anniversary, took time off work, booked an Airbnb by the lake. Thursday night, he came home and told me his ex-girlfriend was going through something heavy and needed support. He said he thought he should stay. I stared at him, waiting for the joke. "You're canceling our anniversary trip for your ex-girlfriend," I said. He told me it wasn't like that she needed him, that I, of all people, should understand what it meant to be there for someone you care about. That was the moment I realized I would always be second place, not to her specifically, but to the past he refused to release. So when he said he couldn't let go of her, I finally believed him, and I let go of him instead. 5 days later, we were still in the same apartment, living separate lives. He slept on the couch. I stayed in the bedroom. We spoke only through texts about logistics. And strangely enough, beneath the sadness, there was relief. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for months without realizing it and finally put it down. The apartment felt smaller once the decision was made, like the walls had quietly leaned in while we weren't looking. 5 days passed in a strange, muted rhythm. I slept in the bedroom with the door closed, the familiar weight of our shared life stripped down to the sound of my own breathing and the low hum of traffic outside. He took the couch, leaving a blanket folded with deliberate neatness every morning, like evidence of restraint or guilt or both. We didn't talk. Not really. Messages were strictly logistical: who was taking out the trash, whose turn it was to pay the internet bill, whether a package at the door belonged to me or him. It was easier that way. Words had already done enough damage. What surprised me most was how little I cried. I kept waiting for the breakdown, the moment when grief would catch up and knock the air out of my lungs. Instead, what I felt was exhaustion, a deep bone-level tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. I realized I'd been bracing myself for disappointment for months, checking my phone to see if plans had been canceled, measuring my reactions so I wouldn't sound jealous, swallowing irritation so I wouldn't be labeled controlling. Now that it was over, the tension eased. Not gone, but lighter. On the morning of the 5th day, I called the landlord. I didn't tell myself I was doing anything permanent. I just said I needed information. I explained that the relationship had ended and asked what my options were. He was practical, almost indifferent. The lease was up in 2 months. As long as rent was covered, he didn't care who stayed. If one of us wanted to leave early, that was fine too. No penalties, no drama. I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the wall. That was it. No legal traps, no shared obligations forcing me to stay and work it out. Just a choice. I opened my laptop and started looking at apartments. Studios mostly. Smaller. Cheaper. Places that belonged to one person, not a couple pretending everything was fine. I found one across town that afternoon. It wasn't impressive, one room, a small kitchen, old floors, but something about it felt honest. It didn't promise anything it couldn't deliver. I scheduled a viewing for the next day and signed the lease 2 hours later. That night, I sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside. I knew what had to happen next, and I didn't want to do it. Not because I doubted the decision, but because I knew he still thought this was temporary. That I'd cool off, that I'd come back around. He was in the living room when I walked in, laptop open, pretending to work. The tension was thick enough to press against my chest. "We need to talk," I said. He closed the laptop, immediately, relief flickering across his face. "About getting back together," he asked, already leaning into hope. I took a breath. "I'm moving out. I found a place across town. I'm signing the lease tomorrow." His face drained of color so fast it was almost frightening. "You're what?" "I talked to the landlord. As long as someone covers rent, he doesn't care who stays. If you want to keep the apartment, you can. If not, we both move out when the lease ends." "You can't just leave," he said, standing up now, hands shaking. "I can't afford this place alone. You know that." "Then find a roommate," I said, "or a cheaper place. It's not my responsibility anymore." The words landed harder than I intended, but I didn't take them back. Because they were true. He stared at me like I'd just uprooted his entire life, which in a way I had. But only because he'd already loosened the ground beneath it. "This is insane," he said. "You're really going to blow everything up because I wanted to help a friend." "Your ex-girlfriend," I corrected. "Not a friend. Your ex-girlfriend, who you've been choosing over me for months." "I haven't chosen her over you," he insisted. I pulled out my phone and opened my calendar. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just listed facts. The anniversary trip we canceled. The wedding after party he left early. Movie nights postponed. Date nights rescheduled. One by one, I named them, watching his defenses crumble in real time. He tried again, softer this time, tears forming, voice low and pleading. He told me he loved me, only me. That he'd block her, stop seeing her, do whatever I needed. "I don't want that," I said quietly. "Because if you do it now, it's because I forced you, not because you chose me. That's not a relationship, that's a hostage situation." He told me that wasn't fair. "What's not fair," I replied, "is building something with someone who's still emotionally invested somewhere else." His mother called later that night. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail accusing me of abandoning him over a misunderstanding and reminding me she'd raised me better than this. I deleted it without listening to the end. By the time I went to bed, my decision felt solid. Heavy, but solid. And for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. The next morning, I woke up with that strange, hollow calm that only comes after a decision has already been made. Not peace exactly, but certainty. The kind that doesn't ask questions anymore. I made coffee in silence, moved carefully around the apartment like a guest in a place that had already stopped feeling like home. He stayed on the couch pretending to sleep until I left for work. Or maybe he actually slept. I didn't ask. By the time I came back that evening, the apartment felt charged, like something sharp was waiting just beneath the surface. He was sitting at the kitchen table this time, phone in hand, leg bouncing. He looked up the moment I stepped inside. "Can we talk?" he asked. "We already did," I said, setting my bag down. "That wasn't a conversation," he insisted. "That was you deciding everything without me." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, grounding myself. "I didn't decide everything. I decided what I'm willing to live with." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration written across his face. You're acting like I cheated on you. I didn't. I never crossed a line. You crossed it every time you chose her needs over our plans, I said. Cheating isn't just physical. It's where your loyalty goes when it matters. That's not fair, he said, again louder this time. She's been in my life for years. You don't just erase that. I didn't ask you to erase it, I replied. I asked you to stop letting it run our relationship. He paced the kitchen, voice rising, then breaking. He told me I was throwing away 3 years over jealousy, that I was being dramatic, that I'd regret it. When that didn't work, he switched gears the way he always did when he felt control slipping. His voice softened, his eyes filled. He came closer. Barbara, he said, using my name like it was an apology, all by itself. I didn't realize how much this was hurting you, I swear. I thought you were okay with it. I can fix this. I didn't move. I'd heard this tone before, after smaller arguments, smaller compromises, promises that lasted just long enough to reset the clock. I'll block her, he said quickly. I'll stop seeing her. I'll do whatever you need. Even 6 months ago, that might have saved us. Now it sounded like a confession instead of a solution. I don't want to be the reason you stop, I said. I want to be the reason you choose. He stared at me, like he didn't understand the difference. His mother called again that night. Then his brother. Then a text from his best friend asking if we could all sit down and talk like adults. It was like a coordinated campaign, everyone circling in to convince me I was overreacting, that this was salvageable, that I was being unreasonable for refusing to compromise. What none of them seemed to understand was that I'd already compromised. Quietly. Repeatedly. I'd compromised every time I swallowed discomfort so I wouldn't be labeled insecure. Every time I adjusted my expectations so he wouldn't feel pressured. Every time I told myself history didn't matter as long as I was the present. By the 3rd day, I started packing. Not everything. Just books. Clothes I didn't wear often. Personal things he wouldn't notice were gone until it was too late. Folding my life into boxes felt surreal, like I was dismantling evidence of something that had existed only in theory for a while now. He watched me from the doorway, arms crossed, disbelief turning into anger. You're really doing this, he said. You're actually packing. Yes. This is cruel, he snapped. You know I don't have anywhere to go. I'm not kicking you out, I said evenly. I'm leaving. That's the same thing. It's not, I replied. I'm not responsible for your housing anymore. That's what breaking up means. His best friend showed up that afternoon without warning. I heard the knock while I was sealing a box and knew exactly who it was before opening the door. She hugged him immediately, then turned to me, with that look people get when they've already decided who the villain is. She made mistakes, she said gently, like she was talking to a child. But you're being really harsh. I'm not punishing him, I said. I'm protecting myself. She sighed, disappointed, like I'd failed some unspoken test. You're really going to walk away after everything? After everything he did, I asked. She didn't answer. By the end of the night, half my life was boxed up. He retreated to the bedroom I used to sleep in, and I took the couch for the first time since the breakup, staring at the ceiling and listening to the apartment settle around me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad anymore. I was done. By the time Saturday morning arrived, the apartment looked like a place mid-evacuation. Boxes lined the hallway. Drawers sat half open. The quiet had shifted into something heavier, filled with the unspoken understanding that this wasn't a phase anymore. This was happening. My friend Daniel showed up just after 9, coffee in one hand and a roll of packing tape in the other. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just hugged me once tight and grounding, then got to work like this was the most natural thing in the world. Every time we carried a box out of the bedroom, my ex had something to say. You're seriously overreacting. You're going to regret this. This is such a dramatic way to handle a misunderstanding. I didn't respond. Silence was the only thing I had left that belonged solely to me, and I wasn't giving it away. Around noon, his best friend came back. This time she didn't knock. She walked straight in. Eyes already red, already armed with arguments. She followed me into the kitchen while Daniel taped another box behind us. Can we talk? She asked. I'm busy, I said, stacking dishes I'd owned long before we moved in together. She's devastated, she said, as if that alone should undo everything. She didn't think you'd actually leave. That's the problem, I replied. He never thought I would. She shook her head. You're acting like she chose someone else over you. He did, I said finally, turning to face her, over and over. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. For a brief moment, I saw doubt flicker across her face. It didn't last. You're being cold, she said instead. I'm being clear. She left shortly after slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames. He disappeared into the bedroom, and for a while the apartment was quiet again. That didn't last. Around 2 in the afternoon, his mother showed up. She came in like a storm voice, already raised eyes, scanning the room like she was taking inventory of everything she thought I was stealing. "What is going on here?" she demanded. "You can't just take everything." "I'm taking my things," I said calmly. "He keeps his." "That couch is half hers," she snapped. "You live together." "It's mine," I replied. "I bought it before we met. I have the receipt." She stepped closer, invading my space, anger sharp and unfiltered. "You are being absolutely horrible to my child. She loved you. She still loves you. And this is how you repay her." Daniel stepped between us without hesitation. "You need to back up," he said firmly. "Don't tell me what to do in my child's home," she shot back. "It's not his home anymore," Daniel replied, "and we'll be done in 30 minutes. The room erupted into crying accusations and raised voices. I didn't engage. I carried boxes. I wrapped furniture. I focused on the physical weight of things instead of the emotional one. Then, at 11:30, the doorbell rang. I didn't need to see who it was to know. His ex-girlfriend stood in the doorway, eyes wide posture, hesitant, like she'd walked into a scene she hadn't expected to face so directly. My ex rushed past me to let her in relief, washing over his face, like she was the answer to a prayer he'd been holding on to. "I'm here to support you," she said softly. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not jealousy, just confirmation. "So this is who you call," I said, my voice steady, "while I'm moving out, because you couldn't let go of her." She looked at him confused. He looked at the floor. "I didn't mean it like that," he said weakly. I picked up the last box from the bedroom and walked toward the door. "Good luck," I said, not to her, not to him, but to the entire situation they'd created together. The door closed behind me with a final solid click. Moving day should have been simple. That was the lie I told myself when I woke up early, dressed quickly, and stared around the half-empty apartment that no longer felt like mine. The plan was basic load, the truck, take the furniture I owned, leave what wasn't mine, and be gone by noon. Clean, efficient, final. Reality had other ideas. Daniel arrived first, followed by 2 other friends who didn't ask questions and didn't need explanations. They took one look at the tension in the apartment and immediately understood that this was not going to be a quiet move. My ex hovered near the door, arms folded tightly across her chest, eyes red from crying that never seemed to stop. The moment we moved toward the couch, the one piece of furniture I cared about, she stepped directly in front of it. "You can't take that," she said, voice shaking. "Where am I supposed to sit?" "Move," I replied calmly. "It's mine. We've been using it together for 2 years. And I've been paying for it for 4, I said. I bought it before I even met you." She didn't move. Daniel asked her 3 times, each time more firmly than the last, until she finally stepped aside, sobbing loudly, as if that somehow changed ownership. The couch went out the door. Something in her seemed to crack when it did. Next came the kitchen. I took what I'd brought into the relationship, pots, plates, my coffee maker. I left the things we'd bought together. It was fair. It was reasonable. It didn't matter. She lost it over the coffee maker. "You're really taking that," she demanded. "What am I supposed to use?" "The French press," I said, "or buy a new one." "This is petty," she snapped. "It's mine," I replied. "This isn't emotional. It's inventory." That was when her mother arrived. She didn't knock. She burst in eyes, blazing voice already raised as if she'd been rehearsing this confrontation the entire drive over. "You cannot do this," she shouted. "You can't just take everything and abandon her like this." "I'm not taking everything," I said evenly. "I'm taking my things. She keeps hers." "That couch is half hers." "No," I replied, "it isn't." She stepped closer, so close I could feel her breath on my face. "You are being cruel, heartless. You think you're so high and mighty, but you'll regret this." Daniel stepped between us instantly. "You need to step back." "This is my daughter's home," she snapped. "It's not," Daniel said flatly. "She's not on the lease. Barbara is, and we're leaving." The room dissolved into noise. Crying accusations, dramatic sighs meant to draw attention. I focused on movement, on progress, on the fact that every box carried out was another step away from chaos. Then, at around 11, the doorbell rang. The timing would have been funny if it wasn't so painfully predictable. She was standing there when the door opened. The ex-girlfriend, the one whose history had mattered more than our future. She looked uncomfortable, unsure, like she hadn't expected to walk directly into the consequences of her presence. My ex rushed toward her immediately. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, grabbing her arm like an anchor. I didn't know what else to do. I felt the last remaining doubt drain out of me. "So this is who you call," I said quietly, looking at both of them. "While I'm moving out of the apartment we shared because you couldn't let go of her." The ex-girlfriend shifted awkwardly. "I'm just here as a friend." "Of course you are," I said. "Try not to get in the way." We finished loading the truck in silence after that. I did a final walkthrough, took photos with timestamps, and made sure there was no excuse left for future accusations. As I stepped out the door for the last time, she tried once more. "Please," she said, tears streaming. "Can we just talk one last time?" "We've talked," I replied. "You chose. Now you get to live with it." Her ex-girlfriend placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe give her some space," she said gently. I looked at them, at the woman I'd loved, at the woman she couldn't let go of, at the mess they'd created together. "Good luck," I said. Then I walked out. The studio apartment smelled like fresh paint and something faintly metallic, the kind of neutral emptiness that only comes with a place no one else has ever lived in with you. It wasn't big. The kitchen barely fit two people standing back to back. The windows faced a brick wall instead of a view. But it was quiet, completely mercifully quiet. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. No tension humming in the background. No phone buzzing with last-minute cancellations. No wondering if tonight was going to turn into another conversation about history and understanding. Just me, my couch, and the steady comfort of knowing exactly where I stood in my own life. The peace didn't last long for him. The messages started the next morning. At first they were careful, polite, almost professional. He asked where I'd moved, said we needed to talk about the lease, mentioned a bill he couldn't find. I answered only what was necessary and ignored the rest. I'd left his number unblocked for logistics, and I regretted it almost immediately. By the end of the week, the tone changed. He missed me. He didn't realize how much I did for him. He was finally seeing things clearly now. He promised again that he'd cut his ex-girlfriend out of his life completely, that this whole thing had scared him straight. I didn't respond. 2 days later, the landlord called me. He sounded tired, the way people do when they already know the answer but hope they're wrong. He said rent hadn't been paid. It was past due, and my ex wasn't answering calls. He asked if I knew what was going on. "I'm out of the lease," I reminded him calmly. "I gave written notice." I know he sighed. "I just thought you might have information." "I don't," I said, "and it's not my responsibility anymore." There was a pause on the line. "Then fair enough. I'll start eviction proceedings if she doesn't respond by the end of the week." 2 days after that, my phone lit up again. She was panicking now. The landlord was threatening eviction. She needed help, just this once. She swore she'd pay me back. She said she was about to be homeless. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "No." The response came instantly, furious and desperate. How could I be so cold? Didn't I care about her at all? After everything we'd shared. "I did," I typed back. "Then you showed me where your priorities were." That was the last message I sent before blocking her number completely. The rest of the fallout came through other people, mutual friends, secondhand updates I hadn't asked for. She'd stopped paying rent entirely. The landlord kept the security deposit. The apartment was listed again within weeks. She moved back in with her parents, furious, embarrassed, and blaming everyone but herself. The ex-girlfriend didn't stick around the way she'd expected. According to a friend who still talked to both of them once the drama turned into responsibility, once support started looking like real commitment instead of nostalgia, the ex-girlfriend pulled back. Suddenly, she needed space. Suddenly, the constant calls were too much. Suddenly, she wasn't as available. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt unsurprised. A few weeks later, I ran into her by accident at the grocery store. We froze for a moment in the produce aisle, recognition passing between us like a quiet acknowledgement of shared history. Neither of us wanted any more. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said awkwardly. I didn't realize how bad it was. "I'm sure," I replied, already turning away. She looked relieved when I didn't push further. So did I. By the time a month had passed, the chaos that once dominated my life felt distant, like something that had happened to a different version of me. Someone less certain. Someone more willing to shrink herself to keep the peace. I wasn't that woman anymore. It's been 6 weeks since I walked out of that apartment and closed the door on a relationship I'd been quietly losing for months. Long enough for the noise to fade. Long enough for patterns to become obvious instead of painful. Long enough to finally see the entire thing clearly without nostalgia blurring the edges. The first week after I blocked her was chaotic, at least from what I heard. Messages went out to everyone who might still have access to me. Friends I barely knew. Her mother again. Even her brother, whom I'd met exactly twice in 3 years, tried to call. Every version of the same plea. "Just talk to her. She loves you. You're making a mistake." I didn't answer. By week 2, the tone shifted from persuasion to panic. She was officially out of the apartment. The landlord had re-rented it. Her security deposit was gone. She was back in her childhood bedroom, furious, and humiliated. The ex-girlfriend, the one she'd been so sure would always be there, had started pulling away. By week 3, that door closed too. I heard about it accidentally from a mutual friend who hadn't realized I'd blocked everyone. The ex-girlfriend had told her she needed space, that the situation had gotten weird, that she felt suffocated. Apparently, once my ex no longer had a stable relationship to fall back on, once she was fully available instead of partially occupied, the dynamic shifted. Nostalgia didn't hold up well under the weight of real expectations. I almost laughed when I heard that. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. A few days later, I got a letter forwarded from the old apartment. 3 pages, handwritten, apologies layered on top of regrets. She wrote that she didn't realize what she had, that she'd taken me for granted, that she should have chosen me. She said she was in therapy now, that she'd changed, that she knew what she wanted, and it was me. I didn't finish the last page. I dropped the letter into the recycling bin and made coffee in my own kitchen with my own coffee maker in a space that belonged to no one but me. Life settled into something unexpectedly gentle after that. Mornings were quiet. Evenings were predictable in the best way. I didn't brace myself for disappointment anymore. I didn't check my phone with a knot in my stomach. I didn't wonder if I was asking for too much by expecting to be prioritized. I started seeing someone new a couple of weeks ago. Nothing serious, no declarations, no future plans built too quickly. We met by accident at a coffee shop, struck up a conversation about a book she was reading. She's a teacher. Funny, grounded. When she says she'll meet me at 7, she shows up at 7. A small thing, but one that still feels almost shocking. On our second date, she asked about my last relationship. I gave her the short version. My boyfriend couldn't let go of his ex-girlfriend. I walked away. She smiled and said, "Good for you. Life's too short to be someone's backup plan." Exactly. The last update I heard about my ex came from that same mutual friend. Apparently, the ex-girlfriend started dating someone new. That sent my ex into a spiral cryptic social media posts about knowing your worth, about people who give up too easily, about timing and fate. The irony wasn't lost on me. People asked if I regretted how I handled things, if I should have stayed longer, tried harder, fought more. But here's the truth. I shouldn't have had to fight to be chosen. The fact that it was even a decision me or her present or past told me everything I needed to know. She wanted to keep her history and her future at the same time. When I forced a choice, she made it. It just wasn't me. And that's not cruelty. That's consequence. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not bitter. I'm just done carrying something that was never meant to be mine to begin with. I have my space, my peace, and the clarity that comes from finally trusting myself instead of doubting my boundaries. That's enough. My name is Maria Thompson. I am 29 years old, and I am currently staring at a piece of cream-colored cardstock that probably cost $5 per unit, wondering if I am hallucinating or if the universe has finally decided to be funny at my expense. The envelope is heavy, textured, calligraphy curling across my name as if the sender knows me well enough to be gentle. The return address belongs to a city my ex-boyfriend moved to 2 years ago without telling me. Inside is a wedding invitation. His wedding invitation. And somehow impossibly, it is addressed to me. 2 years ago, he vanished. No warning, no fight, no explanation, just gone. I had come home from a weekend work trip, rolling my suitcase across the hardwood floor of an apartment that instantly felt wrong. You know that kind of silence, the thick, unnatural kind that presses against your ears. My keys clinked too loudly when I dropped them into the ceramic bowl by the door. The living room looked normal at first glance. The couch was there. The TV was there. But the air was dead like a room after a funeral where no one cried. I walked into the bedroom. His side of the closet wasn't just empty in the doing laundry sense. It was surgically cleared. No shirts, no shoes. Even the hangers were gone. 4 years together, 3 of them living under the same roof, erased in an afternoon. The night before, we had talked about adopting a dog. We'd argued about names. We'd planned a visit to the shelter on Monday. I called him, straight to voicemail. I texted, not delivered. Instagram blocked, Facebook blocked. I called his mother. No answer. I called his best friend. He picked up, paused too long, then said, "He just needs space. Please don't make this weird," and hung up. That was my closure. I spent 3 months crying, 3 months raging, and the last year and a half rebuilding my dignity, brick by brick. I earned a promotion. I repainted the apartment. I learned how to sleep without waiting for a door to open. I started dating a man who communicates like an adult, who doesn't disappear when things get uncomfortable. But there was one loose thread. When my ex left, he was in a hurry. He took his clothes, his toiletries, his gaming console, but he left his music studio. Thousands of dollars worth of vintage synthesizers, rack units, and 2 massive reel-to-reel tape machines stacked in the spare room of an apartment I paid 70% of the rent for. For 2 years, I boxed it up, stored it, lived around it, a shrine to being ghosted. And now, according to this invitation, he wants me at his wedding. I flip over the RSVP card and see a handwritten note from his fiancée, a woman I've never met, saying how much she'd love to meet the people who knew him back then. The pieces click into place with a quiet, sickening clarity. He didn't disappear. He rewrote the story. And he bet everything that I would stay silent. He bet wrong. For a long time after he disappeared, I lived inside questions that had no answers. They followed me everywhere, trailing behind me. Like loose threads I couldn't cut. What did I miss? When did he decide to leave? Was there someone else already waiting in the wings, or did he simply wake up one morning and choose the cleanest exit for himself, no matter how brutal it was for me? Friends tried to help by saying things like, "At least you found out who he really is," but that kind of wisdom only works in hindsight. In the moment, all it does is highlight how powerless you were while it was happening. I replayed our last conversations, endlessly searching for cracks I might have ignored, but all I found were ordinary moments, grocery lists on the fridge, half-finished mugs of coffee plans that assumed tomorrow was guaranteed. The first 3 months were survival mode. I cried in the shower so my neighbors wouldn't hear. I slept on his side of the bed because I was too angry to move his pillow, but too lonely to push it away. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, convinced it would finally be him explaining everything, apologizing, telling me he'd panicked and made a mistake. That message never came. What did come was silence so complete it felt intentional, like a punishment I didn't remember earning. When the tears finally slowed, they were replaced by rage. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, corrosive kind that lives in your chest and makes even breathing feel sharp. Eventually, anger gave way to something steadier. I started rebuilding, not because I felt ready, but because standing still hurt more. I poured myself into work and earned a promotion I'd been chasing for over a year. I repainted the apartment, choosing colors he would have hated on purpose. I rearranged the furniture until nothing reminded me of the way we used to sit together on the couch on Sunday afternoons, legs tangled, pretending the future was uncomplicated. I went on dates. Most of them were terrible. But then I met someone kind, a man who didn't vanish mid-conversation, who answered messages without games, who didn't treat emotional availability like a weakness. I didn't fall into love with him right away, but I learned what calm felt like again, and that mattered more. Still, no matter how much progress I made, the spare room remained untouched. Behind that closed door sat my ex-boyfriend's abandoned life. Vintage synthesizers stacked in flight cases, heavy rack-mounted effects units, and 2 reel-to-reel tape machines so large and dense they felt like anchors. He'd been an aspiring music producer, always talking about legacy, about how this equipment was an investment in his future. When I finally looked up the models online, my stomach dropped. Conservatively, the collection was worth around $12,000. Not something you forget, not something you accidentally leave behind. It wasn't just property, it was proof of how little effort he'd made to clean up the mess he left me with. For 2 years, I debated what to do. I couldn't sell it without following an abandoned property protocol so complicated it bordered on absurd, and throwing it out would have been both illegal and vindictive. I tried reaching out through mutual friends, through people who still occasionally liked my photos but never asked how I was doing. I sent polite messages at first, then firmer ones asking him to come collect his things. Every attempt was met with the same response: nothing. The boxes took up half my storage closet, a physical reminder that he had escaped the consequences of his choices, while I was still paying for them literally and emotionally. So when the wedding invitation arrived, something shifted. Reading his fiancé's note, warm, enthusiastic, completely unaware, I realized he hadn't just left me behind. He'd rewritten me out of his story entirely. In his version, we had drifted apart. In his version, I was an old friend, a harmless chapter. Someone safe enough to invite without consequence. He must have believed I'd roll my eyes, toss the invitation into the trash, and protect his lie by staying away. He was counting on my pride, my desire to avoid discomfort, my silence. That night, I sat on the floor of the spare room, surrounded by boxes labeled in my handwriting, and stared at the equipment I'd been storing for 730 days. I thought about the space it occupied in my home, in my head, in my life. I opened the wedding website on my phone and RSV yes. I selected the chicken cordon bleu without hesitation. Then I closed the laptop, leaned back against the wall, and felt something unexpected settle over me. Not anger, not revenge. Resolve. If he wanted to pretend the past never happened, then I would bring it with me carefully, boxed, fully accounted for, and returned exactly where it belonged. Once I made the decision, everything became strangely calm. The chaos that had lived in my head for 2 years finally organized itself into a plan. And there is a particular kind of peace that comes with clarity, even when what you're planning is deeply uncomfortable. I wasn't imagining dramatic confrontations or shouting matches. I didn't want tears or apologies or even acknowledgement from him. What I wanted was simple: my space back, my life unburdened, and the truth placed exactly where it could no longer be ignored. I told my best friend first. She was there for every stage of the fallout. 2 years ago, the late-night phone calls, the emergency whine runs the mornings when I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed. She listened as I explained the invitation, the note from the fiancé, the boxes still stacked in my spare room like unpaid debt. When I told her my plan, she didn't interrupt or question my sanity. She just stared at me for a moment, then said, "Okay, I'll take the day off work." By the next morning, she had bought a dress specifically for the occasion. Something elegant, but understated, the kind of outfit that says I belong here without asking permission. The logistics were the least emotional part of the process, which surprised me. My sedan wouldn't fit even half of the equipment, so I rented a white cargo van, the kind contractors use, nondescript and practical. I reserved a dolly rated for industrial weight, because those reel-to-reel machines were no joke. As I confirmed the pickup time, I felt almost businesslike, as if I were preparing for a move rather than a confrontation with the person who had once promised to build a life with me. I labeled every box, clearly documenting their condition with dated photos, not out of paranoia, but habit. I'd learned the hard way that preparation is often mistaken for cruelty by people who rely on chaos to protect themselves. In the days leading up to the wedding, I replayed every possible outcome in my mind. Maybe he'd see me across the room and pull me aside, finally offering an explanation. Maybe he'd panic and try to have security escort me out. Maybe nothing would happen at all, and I'd quietly hand over the equipment and leave without a ripple. What I knew for certain was that I wouldn't raise my voice, and I wouldn't allow him to paint me as unstable. I wasn't showing up as his ex. I was showing up as the woman who had been storing his $12,000 worth of property for 2 years without compensation or apology. The morning of the wedding, I woke up before my alarm. My stomach wasn't in knots the way I expected it to be. Instead, there was a steady hum of adrenaline, like the moments before a presentation you've rehearsed too many times to mess up. I dressed carefully, choosing something neutral and tailored, nothing dramatic, nothing attention-seeking. I wanted to look like someone who belonged anywhere she decided to stand. My best friend arrived just as I finished my coffee, her energy bright and grounded, the kind of presence that reminds you you're not doing this alone. We loaded the van methodically. The first synthesizer went in easily, its flight case scuffed and familiar. The second was heavier, requiring both of us to maneuver it onto the dolly. The reel-to-reel machines came last, dense and stubborn, their weight a physical reminder of how much I'd been carrying for someone who couldn't even send a text. As we closed the van doors, I felt a strange sense of finality, like sealing a chapter shut. The drive to the venue took 40 minutes, long enough for the doubts to creep in, whispering that maybe this was unnecessary, that maybe I should have just followed the paperwork and waited another year for legal abandonment. But then I pictured his fiancé's handwriting on that RSVP card, the casual confidence with which she'd invited me into a story built on omission. He had chosen public silence over private accountability. I was simply respecting the setting he picked. As we pulled into the venue's gravel lot, a rustic barn framed by string lights and manicured lawns, I turned off the engine and sat still for a moment. I took a breath, steady and deliberate. "We're not here to cause a scene," I said more to myself than anyone else. My best friend smiled, already unfolding the dolly. "No," she replied. "You're here to finish something." And for the first time in 2 years, I felt ready to do exactly that. We timed it carefully. Not early enough to be conspicuous, not late enough to miss the moment when everyone was still paying attention to everyone else. The ceremony had already ended by the time we arrived, the kind of quiet compromise I could live with. I didn't need to watch him make vows I suspected were recycled from the same internet templates we once laughed about together. I needed witnesses, not sentiment. Cocktail hour was beginning, guests spilling out onto the lawn in clusters of laughter and clinking glasses, the air thick with cedar perfume and curated happiness. The venue was one of those rustic, chic barns that look effortlessly charming because someone spent a fortune making sure they did. Whitewashed wood fairy lights strung just so, a gift table positioned near the entrance where envelopes and boxed kitchenware formed a careful little altar to domestic optimism. That's where he was standing when I saw him, my ex-boyfriend, champagne flute in hand, smiling in the practiced way people do when they think they're safe. Beside him was his bride, radiant and bright-eyed greeting guests with genuine enthusiasm. For a brief second, I wondered if I would falter if the years we spent together would suddenly demand tenderness. Then he looked up. The color drained from his face so quickly, it was almost impressive. Not faded, vanished. His smile collapsed, and the glass in his hand began to tremble hard enough that I thought it might shatter. He looked like someone watching a car accident in slow motion, fully aware of the impact and powerless to stop it. His bride followed his gaze, confusion flickering across her face before transforming into delight. She let go of his hand and stepped toward me, pulling him along as if he were just another accessory. "You must be Maria," she said brightly. "I'm so glad you came. He said you might be too busy." Her grip was warm, earnest, and completely unaware of the tension vibrating beside her. "I wouldn't have missed it," I replied, smiling the kind of polite, controlled smile that doesn't invite questions. And I couldn't come empty-handed. I gestured behind me, where my best friend was already unloading the dolly from the van, parked conveniently close to the entrance. The first flight case rolled into view, its scuffed black exterior, a sharp contrast to the pastel gift boxes stacked nearby. The bride's smile faltered confusion, knitting her brow as she turned to look at my ex. "What's this?" she asked. He finally found his voice, though it came out thin and strained. "We can talk about this later. Let's just put it somewhere else." "Oh, I don't want to keep storing it for you," I said, my voice carrying easily to the nearby cluster of relatives sipping wine. "It's been 2 years." I maneuvered the dolly forward, careful and deliberate. "Since you blocked my number, moved cities, and left all of this in my apartment, this seemed like the most efficient way to return your property." The temperature around us dropped, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations nearby, slowed curiosity sharpening faces as the words landed. The bride's hand slipped from his, her expression shifting from confusion to something more alert, more calculating. "You blocked her," she asked him quietly. "You told me you two were still emailing." "We haven't spoken since the day he moved out while I was at work," I said gently, almost kindly. "Here's the reel-to-reel. Be careful with it. The left spool is finicky, but you probably already know that." I nodded toward the equipment, my tone conversational, as if we were discussing furniture delivery. My best friend rolled up with the second load stacking synthesizers beside the gift table. The visual was absurd, industrial black cases looming next to pastel wrapping paper and congratulatory cards. My ex leaned toward me, his voice low and furious. "You are insane. Get this trash out of here." "It's not trash," I replied, keeping my volume steady. "It's your Profit 5. You called it your legacy. I've kept it safe for 730 days. I turned to the bride, who was now studying him with a sharpness that hadn't been there moments ago. "He hates it when people touch the knobs without washing their hands first. Just a heads up." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then I stepped back, releasing the dolly, my role complete. "I hope you have a beautiful marriage," I said sincerely. I'm glad I could finally clear the space. I turned and walked away before anyone could stop me, my heels crunching softly against the gravel as I returned to the van. My best friend was already in the driver's seat, eyes wide and shining. As we pulled away, laughter bubbled out of her, unrestrained and cathartic. We drove 5 miles down the road to a diner and ordered pancakes like we'd just finished a long shift rather than detonated a carefully maintained lie. My phone buzzed 20 minutes later, an unknown number. "This is the bride's maid of honor," the text read. That was the most punk rock thing I've ever seen. Also, he's crying in the bridal suite and she's drinking vodka straight from the bottle. Thought you should know. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that comes when something long overdue has finally been set right. I woke up the next morning expecting regret to hit me like a hangover, but instead there was only a strange, buoyant quiet. The kind that settles in after a storm has passed and the air feels lighter because everything heavy has already fallen. That calm lasted until my phone started buzzing on the kitchen counter, vibrating itself dangerously close to the edge. Not his number, he was still too proud to unblock me, but an unfamiliar email notification with his name in the subject line typed in all caps, as if volume could substitute for authority. The message was long, rambling, and theatrical. He accused me of ruining the most important day of his life, of humiliating him in front of his family, of acting with malicious intent. He demanded compensation for emotional distress, transportation costs, and the inconvenience of having to explain himself. He even suggested I should have paid to ship the equipment to him instead of ambushing him at his own wedding, conveniently forgetting that he had invited me there himself. I read it once, then again more slowly, sipping my coffee until I laughed out loud at the sheer audacity of it. When people like him lose control of the narrative, they don't look inward, they look for someone to punish. 5 days later, the appetizer arrived in the form of that email's sequel, a certified letter, delivered with unnecessary drama. He hadn't hired a lawyer, he was too cheap and too confident for that, but he'd found a free legal template online and filled it in himself. I could tell because he forgot to delete the insert date here placeholder on the second page. According to his homemade demand letter, I owed him $2,500 in venue violation fees because the barn charged them for unauthorized vendor loading when I pulled the van up front. Another $500 for storage and handling because he'd apparently had to hire someone to move the equipment into his parents' SUV. And finally, a public apology on my social media declaring that I was mentally unstable and that our breakup had been mutual to restore his reputation among his in-laws. I laughed so hard I nearly choked. Then my phone rang. It was her. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, weighing whether answering would pull me back into something I'd already walked away from. But curiosity won out, and a quiet instinct told me that if she was calling, the collapse had already started. "Hello," I said. "Did you know?" she asked immediately. Her voice brittle, stripped of pleasantries. "Did you know about everything?" "I don't know what he has told you," I replied carefully. "That you dated for 6 months, that it was casual, that you drifted apart." Her words came faster now, unraveling. "He said you were obsessed and wouldn't let him get his things back." "We lived together for 3 years," I said gently. "We were on a lease. We shared bills. We were talking about adopting a dog." There was silence on the line, heavy and final. "I have emails from 2 years ago asking him to pick up the equipment. I can forward them if you want." "Please," she whispered. I sent the screenshots, timestamps, unanswered messages, polite requests, slowly turning desperate. Evidence isn't loud, but it's devastating when someone is ready to see it. She called back an hour later, sounding hollow. "He's threatening to sue you," she said. "He's screaming about scratches on the equipment." "They were there when he bought it in 2019, I replied calmly. "I have photos from the day before the wedding." Another pause. Then she sighed. "I don't want you involved in our marriage," she said quietly. "I don't want to be either," I told her. "He invited me. I just returned what was his." After that, the mask really slipped. He sent a Venmo request for $3,000 labeled damages and emotional terrorism. I declined it. That was when he finally unblocked me to unleash a stream of venom, calling me bitter, jealous, unstable, threatening lawsuits, and boasting that his father was a lawyer. I replied once calmly, clearly correcting the lie about his father, listing the documentation I had, and warning him not to contact me again. He responded with emojis that said more about him than any words could. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I came home to a note from my landlord taped to my door. A complaint had been filed alleging illegal subletting and commercial business activity in my unit. I stood there reading it twice, the implications sinking in. He had called my landlord, reported me, claimed I was running a business out of my apartment by storing his equipment. Maybe worse. I went straight to the leasing office, heart-pounding documentation already pulled up on my phone. The property manager recognized his name immediately and laughed when I explained. "The guy with the terrible mustache," she asked. "He called here screaming that you were trafficking stolen goods." He sounded unhinged. "Don't worry, you're on the lease. He isn't." As I walked back to my apartment, the realization settled in with cold clarity. He wasn't trying to get his stuff back anymore. He was trying to burn my life down because I'd embarrassed him. And in doing so, he was proving to me, to her, to everyone watching, exactly who he had always been. By the time a month had passed, the noise finally died down. No more Venmo requests. No more emails dressed up as legal threats. No more late-night messages dripping with blame and entitlement. I sent the cease and desist letter with the help of a paralegal friend, detailed, formal, and mercilessly factual. It outlined his abandonment of property, the documented harassment, the false report to my landlord, and a polite reminder that filing false police reports, which he had hinted at in one of his messages, is an actual crime. I mailed one copy to him, and because I was feeling thorough rather than cruel, I mailed another to the address listed on the wedding invitation, the apartment he now shared with his wife. 2 days later, the silence became absolute. I assumed that would be the end of it. I was ready to go back to my normal life to enjoy the absence of clutter in both my home and my head. The spare room was finally empty sunlight, it spilling across clean carpet where boxes had once been stacked like a barricade. I bought a Peloton and tucked it neatly into the corner, its presence purposeful and forward-looking. For the first time in years, that room belonged entirely to me. Then, on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, I heard her voice. I was standing in line at a coffee shop near my office, waiting for my usual oat latte, when someone behind me said, "Hey." I turned, and there she was, his bride, or rather, his almost wife. She looked different than she had at the wedding, stripped of polish and ceremony, her hair pulled back dark circles under her eyes. Most notably, there was no ring on her finger. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with the instinctive desire to avoid another scene. "Can I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair at my table once we had our drinks. I nodded. "Sure." She wrapped her hands around her cup, staring into it, as if the answer to everything might be floating in the foam. "You were right about the scratches on the moog," she said, finally, a dry, humorless laugh escaping her. "About everything, actually." She took a breath, steadying herself. "He didn't just lie about you. He lied about his job. He told me he was a senior producer. He's an unpaid intern. His parents pay his rent." I winced. "When we were together, he was a barista," I said quietly. She nodded, unsurprised. "The wedding gifts were mostly cash. He tried to take all of it the Monday after the wedding to buy a new car. Said he'd earned it by dealing with the stress you caused." Her mouth tightened. I left. "We never filed the marriage certificate. My mom is a paralegal. She told me to run, so I did." I didn't know what to say to that. "I'm sorry I offered because sometimes there are no better words." She reached into her purse and placed a small, heavy object on the table between us, a vintage silver-capped knob from one of the synthesizers. "You forgot this," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It fell off when his dad was loading the equipment. He tore the apartment apart looking for it. Said it devalued the unit by $500. I pushed it back toward her. "Keep it," I said. "A souvenir." She laughed, then genuinely, and stood. "Thank you for RSVPing," she said softly. "You saved me a lot of time." After she left, I walked home slowly, letting the weight of the past month settle and then finally lift. A mutual friend later reached out to apologize for cutting me off, telling me my ex was back living in his parents' basement, trying and failing to sell the equipment without original boxes or manuals. Apparently, his reputation in the local music scene was ruined, not because of me, but because the truth has a way of traveling once it's finally released. That night, I opened the door to the spare room and stood there for a moment. No boxes, no ghosts, just clean space and quiet. I turned off the light and closed the door without looking back. The debt was paid, the clutter was gone, and honestly, the chicken cordon bleu had been dry anyway.